It was 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in November when Michael Jordan's phone rang with the kind of urgency that immediately signals something is deeply wrong. The sound cut through the silence of his Highland Park estate like a cry for help that would forever change how he understood his closest friend and teammate. When Michael saw Scottie Pippen's name on the screen, his first thought was of injury or a family emergency. What he heard when he answered was something far more profound and heartbreaking. The sound of one of the strongest, most resilient people he knew, completely falling apart. "Michael," came Scottie's voice, broken by sobs that seemed to come from a place deeper than physical pain. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend I'm okay when everything inside me is falling apart." Those words, "I can't do this anymore," would echo in Michael's mind for weeks afterward, not because they represented giving up, but because they represented the first time in their long, storied partnership that Scottie Pippen had allowed anyone to see him completely vulnerable. You can perceive that there are moments in life when the people we think we know best reveal depths of struggle that shock us into understanding how little we truly see of the battles others fight in silence. To fully comprehend why Scottie Pippen's desperate call to Michael Jordan would destroy everyone who heard about it, why it would fundamentally change how the Bulls organization, the NBA, and millions of fans understood mental health in professional sports, we need to go back to the months of silent suffering that led to that moment of complete emotional breakdown. For the previous 6 months, those closest to Scottie Pippen had noticed subtle changes that in retrospect were clear signals of someone struggling with an invisible weight. But Scottie had always been the steady one, the calm, versatile presence who never seemed rattled by pressure, criticism, or the immense shadow cast by playing alongside the greatest basketball player of all time. His reputation as the unflappable, stoic forward for the Bulls had become so established that even when he began showing signs of distress, people attributed it to temporary frustration over a contract dispute or physical fatigue rather than a genuine crisis. Scottie always handled everything so smoothly. Phil Jackson, the Bulls head coach, would later reflect, "When someone has been your rock for so long, you don't immediately recognize when they're the one who needs support." The first sign had been Scottie's increasing isolation during team functions. A team psychologist, Dr. Elena Ramirez, who worked with the players on focus and mental conditioning, had noticed during training camp that Scottie was participating in conversations less frequently. He would arrive exactly on time instead of early, as was his habit, and leave immediately after practice, rather than staying for the casual interactions that had always been part of his routine. Athletes often develop coping mechanisms that involve routine and predictability, Dr. Ramirez would explain later. When someone starts changing patterns that have been consistent for years, it can indicate internal struggle, but those changes are often subtle enough that they're overlooked until they become more dramatic. The sound of a phone ringing at 3 in the morning carries a weight that immediately communicates emergency. But the particular quality of desperation in Scottie's voice that night revealed that this crisis had been building for much longer than anyone had realized. What's most heartbreaking is how people who appear strongest on the outside often carry the heaviest burdens in private, developing such effective masks of composure that even those who love them most don't recognize when they're drowning until they finally cry out for help. During the months leading up to that call, Scottie had been battling something that went far beyond basketball performance or public expectations. A leading sports psychologist, Dr. Marcus Thorne, who had worked with several high-profile athletes, would later identify Scottie's struggle as a complex combination of perfectionism, identity crisis, and what he termed reflected glory anxiety, the paradoxical stress that can develop when one's own monumental achievements are constantly viewed through the prism of an even more celebrated teammate. Scottie had spent years being viewed as the perfect second-in-command, the ultimate teammate, Dr. Thorne observed. But when your identity becomes built around being the essential but secondary piece of a dynasty, it creates enormous pressure to never show weakness or need, even when you're suffering internally from the weight of those expectations. The specific triggers for Scottie's crisis were multiple and interconnected. He had been dealing with persistent concerns about his long-term health after multiple nagging injuries. He wrestled with deep-seated frustrations over his contract, which famously paid him far less than his market value, leading to a feeling of being underappreciated. And there were deeper existential concerns about his own legacy and identity, questions of purpose and fulfillment that can affect athletes who wonder if their own greatness will ever be fully recognized on its own terms. But perhaps most significantly, Scottie had been carrying the immense pressure to help maintain a dynasty, combined with a quiet guilt about any personal failing that might jeopardize their championship runs. The weight of expectation, both external and self-imposed, had gradually eroded his mental resilience to the point where normal daily challenges felt overwhelming. People saw Scottie as mentally tough because he didn't show emotion publicly, a member of the coaching staff noted. But what we learned is that emotional regulation and emotional suppression are very different things. Scottie had become so skilled at suppressing difficult feelings that he lost touch with how to process them healthfully. You can perceive that sometimes the qualities we most admire in people, their composure, reliability, strength, can become prisons that prevent them from seeking help when they need it most. During the summer before that November phone call, several people close to Scottie had noticed changes that seemed concerning in retrospect. His family members mentioned that he seemed more distant during visits. Teammates observed that his usually sharp, observant humor had become less frequent. Even his pre-game routines, which had been religiously consistent for years, had begun showing minor variations that suggested internal distraction. Looking back, Michael would later say, "There were signs that Scottie was struggling, but they were so subtle. And he was so good at redirecting conversations away from himself that I didn't put together what was really happening. I thought it was just the usual grind." The evening before the phone call, Scottie had attended a team dinner that, to outside observers, seemed completely normal. He participated in conversations, laughed at appropriate moments, and gave no obvious indication that he was hours away from an emotional breakdown. But Dr. Ramirez, who had been trained to observe subtle behavioral indicators, noticed something in Scottie's demeanor that concerned her. There was a quality to Scottie's interactions that night that seemed performative rather than genuine, Jennifer remembered. He was going through the motions of social engagement, but there was an emptiness behind his responses that suggested he was operating on autopilot rather than authentic connection. After the dinner, Scottie had returned to his home and spent several hours in what he would later describe as the longest, darkest mental space he had ever experienced. The combination of emotional exhaustion from maintaining his public persona, overwhelming anxiety about his future, and a crushing sense of loneliness despite being surrounded by people who revered him had reached a breaking point. How is it possible that someone can feel most alone when surrounded by teammates, friends, and fans who genuinely love and support them? Simply because they've never learned to communicate their deepest fears and vulnerabilities. The specific moment that triggered Scottie's call to Michael came around 2:30 that morning when he found himself crying in his kitchen over what seemed like a trivial frustration, but which represented the final straw in months of accumulated emotional pressure. The realization that he couldn't stop crying, couldn't regain his usual composure, and couldn't imagine facing another day of pretending everything was fine had terrified him into recognizing that he needed immediate help. "I had always been the person who handled things internally," Scottie would later explain. "But that night, I realized that handling things internally had become not handling things at all. I was just storing pain until I ran out of space for it." His decision to call Michael hadn't been calculated or planned. It had been pure instinct, a drowning person reaching for the closest lifeline. Scottie had scrolled through his contacts, seeing names of family members, teammates, and friends, but had stopped at Michael's name because some part of him understood that Michael, for all his demanding intensity, would respond with immediate, decisive support rather than judgment or questions he wasn't ready to answer. When you're in crisis, Dr. Ramirez explains, you often instinctively reach out to the person who makes you feel safest, not necessarily the person who's most equipped to help. For Scottie, Michael represented an unbreakable bond forged in the heat of battle. What's most impressive is how true friendship creates a kind of emotional safety net that allows people to be completely vulnerable, knowing they'll be caught with loyalty rather than judgment, support rather than solutions, presence rather than pressure to explain or justify their pain. The phone had rung twice before Michael answered, and even in those few seconds, Scottie had almost hung up multiple times, his finger hovering over the end call button, as waves of shame and fear about revealing his vulnerability battled with a desperate need for connection and support. "Hello," Michael had said, his voice carrying the alert concern that comes with middle-of-the-night calls, immediately understanding that something significant was happening. And then Scottie had spoken those words that would change everything. "Michael, I can't do this anymore." True strength is not never breaking. It's having the courage to ask for help when you need to be rebuilt. And sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is admit to someone we trust that the persona we've maintained for years no longer matches the reality of what we're experiencing internally. The conversation that followed would last for 2 hours and 17 minutes, during which Michael would hear details about his best friend's internal struggles that would make him realize how much pain Scottie had been carrying alone. But more importantly, it would begin a process of healing and transformation that would not only save Scottie's mental health, but would change how the entire Bulls organization approached player well-being. The sound of that phone ringing at 3:17 a.m. had carried more than emergency. It had carried trust, vulnerability, and the beginning of a journey that would prove that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, but often the first step toward finding a strength you never knew you possessed. As Michael listened to his friend's pain with complete attention and unconditional loyalty, neither of them knew that this moment of crisis would ultimately become a turning point, not just for Scottie, but for countless others who would be inspired by his courage to seek help when they needed it most. The breakdown that seemed like an ending was actually a beginning. The first step in a healing process that would reveal that vulnerability, shared with the right people, can become the foundation for stronger mental health, deeper relationships, and a more authentic way of living that honors both strength and struggle as essential parts of the human experience. What happened next would show the world that some of the most important victories in sports have nothing to do with games won or records broken, but with lives saved through the simple act of one person saying, "I can't do this anymore," and another person responding, "You don't have to do it alone." In the months leading up to that desperate 3:00 a.m. phone call, Scottie Pippen had been living what Dr. Thorne would later describe as a double life, maintaining his public persona as the composed, reliable Bull while privately battling an escalating mental health crisis that he felt powerless to address or even acknowledge. The signs had been there, scattered across conversations, behaviors, and moments that those who loved him had noticed, but hadn't connected into the larger picture of someone slowly drowning in plain sight. Dr. Ramirez had been working with professional athletes for over a decade, and she had learned to recognize the subtle indicators that distinguish temporary stress from deeper psychological distress. During the Bulls training camp in September, she had begun documenting small changes in Scottie's behavior that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a concerning pattern. Scottie started arriving exactly on time instead of 15 minutes early, which had been his routine for years, she noted in her confidential observations. He would participate in team meetings but rarely initiated conversations afterward. Most telling, he had stopped making the small strategic observations that had always been part of his genius. A trusted assistant coach had noticed similar changes during individual skill sessions. Scottie's defensive instincts remained flawless, but his usual post-practice analysis and questions about team strategy had become perfunctory rather than engaged. It was like watching someone go through the motions of being Scottie Pippen, the coach would later explain, rather than actually being Scottie Pippen. He was performing his role instead of living it. You can perceive that sometimes the most concerning changes in people we care about aren't dramatic departures from their normal behavior, but subtle diminishments of the qualities that make them uniquely themselves. The first significant warning sign had occurred in early October during a team dinner at a private room in a Chicago steakhouse. Juanita Vanoy, Michael's wife, had always prided herself on helping create an environment where the Bulls players felt like extended family, and Scottie had historically been one of the most engaging presences, often holding court with his quiet but sharp insights. That night, Scottie seemed present, but distant, Juanita would later recall. He participated when directly addressed, but he wasn't initiating the kind of playful banter that had always made him such a joy to have around. When I asked if he was feeling okay, he gave me what I now recognize was a rehearsed response about just being tired from the preseason grind. What Juanita didn't know was that Scottie had spent the drive to the restaurant giving himself what he privately called a performance prep talk, mentally rehearsing how to appear normal and engaged, while internally feeling completely disconnected from everything around him. I had developed this script of responses, Scottie would later explain to his therapist. Someone asks how I'm doing, I say, great. Just focused on the season. Someone mentions the pressure. I make a joke about it being just another Tuesday. I had become an actor playing myself, and I was exhausted from the performance. Dr. Thorne explains this phenomenon as social masking, a common coping mechanism where individuals experiencing depression or anxiety become highly skilled at mimicking their previous personality in social situations, often fooling even close friends and family members. The energy required to maintain a social mask is enormous, Dr. Thorne notes. It's like running a marathon while pretending you're taking a casual walk. Eventually, that level of emotional labor becomes unsustainable. What's most heartbreaking is how people experiencing a mental health crisis often become their own harshest critics, interpreting their struggle to maintain their usual personality as a personal failure, rather than recognizing it as a signal that they need support and care. During late October, Scottie had experienced what would later be identified as his first major cry for help, though it was so subtle that even he didn't fully recognize it as such at the time. After a particularly difficult practice where he felt his timing was off, he had lingered in the gym long after his teammates left, working on his footwork with an intensity that bordered on frantic. Dr. Ramirez had returned to retrieve something from her office and had observed Scottie from the tunnel, noting in her journal, Scottie stayed late, practicing with what looked like anger rather than focus. When he stumbled on a defensive slide, I saw him pause and put his head in his hands for almost 30 seconds. This is completely uncharacteristic behavior. What she couldn't hear from her position was Scottie quietly saying to himself, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I just be normal anymore?" Words that represented his growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted in his mental state, but which he felt unable to share with anyone. The following week, Scottie had made his first tentative attempt to reach out for support, though it was so indirect that the opportunity was missed by everyone involved. During a team meeting focused on the upcoming season, when each player was asked to share something they wanted to work on, Scottie had said, "I want to work on being more present, like really present, not just going through the motions." At the time, we all thought he was talking about basketball focus, a teammate reflected. But looking back, he was telling us that he felt disconnected from his own life. He was asking for help in the only way he felt safe doing so. Michael Jordan, who had known Scottie longer and better than anyone on the team, had sensed that something in his friend's energy felt different, but had attributed it to the natural pressures of defending another title and their shared concerns about the physical toll of their long seasons. Scottie had always been introspective, Michael would later say. So when he seemed more quiet than usual, I thought he was just processing the challenges we were all facing. I wish I had pushed a little deeper, asked more specific questions about how he was feeling emotionally, rather than just assuming he was handling everything the way he always had. How is it possible that the people who love us most can be right next to us and still not see our pain, especially when we've become experts at hiding it even from ourselves? The crisis had deepened significantly in November, triggered by a combination of factors that created what Dr. Thorne describes as a perfect storm of psychological pressure. Scottie had been dealing with persistent pain from old injuries, constant media narratives about his contract and his role, and a growing sense that his identity was too narrowly tied to being Michael Jordan's teammate. But the factor that proved most destabilizing was something seemingly positive. The Bulls had been playing exceptionally well, and Scottie's performance had been statistically excellent. However, instead of feeling satisfied, Scottie found himself unable to enjoy or connect with his success. This is one of the cruelest aspects of depression, explains Dr. Ramirez. It can rob you of the ability to feel joy even when good things are happening. For an athlete whose entire identity is built around performance and achievement, losing the ability to feel satisfaction from success can be particularly devastating. Scottie had begun experiencing what psychologists term anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure in activities that previously brought joy. Basketball, which had been his passion and escape for most of his life, had started feeling mechanical and empty. The cheers of crowds sounded distant, victories felt hollow, and even time spent with teammates felt like an obligation rather than a connection. I remember thinking that maybe I was just burned out, Scottie would later explain. But it was deeper than that. It was like someone had turned down the volume on all my emotions except anxiety and sadness. Everything that used to make me happy felt gray and distant. You can perceive that sometimes the most frightening aspect of mental health struggles isn't the presence of negative emotions, but the absence of positive ones. The feeling that joy and satisfaction have become unreachable, no matter what achievements or experiences we encounter. The specific incident that had pushed Scottie toward his breaking point had occurred during a team practice in mid-November. During a routine scrimmage, he had made a defensive mistake that resulted in an easy basket for the opposing team. Historically, such minor errors were part of the learning process that Scottie handled with characteristic equanimity. But that day, the mistake had triggered an internal cascade of self-criticism so intense that he had to excuse himself from practice, claiming he felt ill. I went to the bathroom and just stared at myself in the mirror, Scottie would later describe, and I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. There was this voice in my head saying terrible things, that I was letting everyone down, that I didn't deserve my position, that I was a fraud who had been lucky for years but was finally being exposed. This internal experience represented what psychologists call catastrophic thinking, a cognitive pattern where minor setbacks are interpreted as evidence of fundamental personal inadequacy. For someone like Scottie, whose self-worth had become intricately tied to consistent, near-perfect performance, this kind of thinking pattern can be particularly toxic. Dr. Thorne notes, when someone's identity is primarily external based on performance, achievement, or others' perceptions, they become extremely vulnerable to this kind of negative thought spiral because they have fewer internal resources for self-worth when external validation feels threatened. In the days following that practice, Scottie had begun experiencing physical symptoms that accompany severe anxiety, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and what he described as feeling like there was something heavy sitting on my chest all the time. He had started declining social invitations, including his traditional post-practice meals with teammates, claiming he needed to focus on extra preparation. What's most tragic is how mental health struggles can create isolation, precisely when connection and support are most needed, as shame and fear of judgment drive people away from the relationships that could provide healing and hope. Dr. Ramirez had made several attempts to check in with Scottie during this period, but his responses had been polite deflections that gave no indication of the severity of his internal experience. When she asked about his mood, he would redirect to basketball topics. When she inquired about his sleep or stress levels, he would minimize any concerns and change the subject. Looking back, I realized that Scottie had become highly skilled at deflecting wellness check-ins, she reflects. He knew exactly what answers would satisfy people's concerns without revealing anything real about his internal state. It's a survival mechanism that many high-achieving individuals develop, but it ultimately prevents them from getting the help they need. The evening before his call to Michael, Scottie had experienced what would later be recognized as a severe anxiety attack during the team dinner. While maintaining external composure, He had been overwhelmed by racing thoughts, difficulty breathing, and an intense feeling of disconnection from reality. He had managed to complete the social obligation, but the effort had left him completely depleted. "I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body," Scottie would later explain. "Like I was an actor who had forgotten all his lines but was still trying to stay in character. By the time I got home, I was so exhausted from pretending to be okay that I couldn't imagine doing it for even one more day." How is it possible that the very strength and composure we develop to handle life's challenges can become barriers that prevent us from seeking help when those same qualities are no longer enough to sustain us? Alone in his home that night, Scottie had finally allowed himself to fully acknowledge what he had been avoiding for months. He was not okay, had not been okay for a significant period of time, and could not continue pretending otherwise without risking something fundamental about his mental health and well-being. The realization had been both terrifying and oddly relieving. Terrifying because it meant acknowledging that his usual coping mechanisms had failed him. Relieving because it meant he could stop expending energy maintaining a facade that had become unbearable. True strength is not never breaking. It's having the courage to ask for help when you need to be rebuilt. And sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is admit that the version of ourselves we've been presenting to the world no longer matches the reality of our internal experience. As the clock moved past midnight, Scottie had found himself crying in a way he hadn't since childhood. Not the controlled tears of frustration or disappointment he was familiar with, but the deep, overwhelming sobs of someone who had been holding back an ocean of pain and could no longer contain it. It was in that moment of complete emotional release that Scottie had understood he needed immediate support. Not just from anyone, but from someone who would respond with unconditional loyalty rather than questions, solutions, or expectations. Someone who would simply be present with his pain until he could find his way back to stability. The sound of his phone ringing Michael's number would carry more than a cry for help. It would carry years of accumulated struggle, the weight of perfectionism that had become poisonous, and the beginning of a healing process that would teach both men that vulnerability shared with the right person can become the foundation for stronger mental health and more authentic relationships. What Scottie didn't know as he dialed Michael's number was that his courage to reach out during his darkest moment would ultimately save not just his own life, but would inspire countless others to seek help when they needed it most, proving that sometimes the most important victories happen not on playing fields, but in quiet moments when someone chooses connection over isolation, honesty over performance, and healing over hiding. The conversation that unfolded over the next 2 hours and 17 minutes would become a masterclass in how to respond to someone in crisis with loyalty, presence, and the kind of tough wisdom that saves lives. Michael had answered the phone on the second ring, immediately alert despite the late hour. The sound of Scottie's voice, broken, desperate, completely unlike anything he had ever heard from his normally composed friend, had shocked him into complete focus. "Scottie, what the hell is wrong? What's happening?" Michael had asked, his voice carrying the urgent, demanding concern of someone who understood that this call represented something serious beyond his ability to immediately comprehend. I can't keep pretending anymore, Mike," Scottie had said through sobs that seemed to come from a place deeper than physical exhaustion. "I wake up every morning and I put on this mask and I go through the motions of being Scottie Pippen, but inside I feel like I'm dying." The word dying had hit Michael like a physical blow. Dr. Ramirez, who would later help Michael process this conversation, explains that when someone uses such extreme language during a mental health crisis, it often indicates they're experiencing what psychologists call psychological pain, emotional distress so intense that it feels life-threatening, even when the person isn't actively suicidal. You can perceive that sometimes the most important thing we can do when someone shares their deepest pain with us is simply to listen without trying to fix, judge, or minimize what they're experiencing. "Talk to me. Tell me what's going on," Michael had said, his voice steadying despite his own shock. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Tell me everything." What followed was Scottie's first completely honest account of his internal experience in months. He described feeling like he was watching his life from outside his body, going through the motions of practices, games, and social interactions, while feeling completely disconnected from everything that had once brought him joy. Basketball used to be my escape, Scottie had explained, his voice breaking. When everything else in life was complicated or stressful, I could always find peace on the court. But now, even when we're winning, when I'm playing well, I feel nothing. It's like someone turned off all the lights inside me, and I don't know how to turn them back on. Michael had felt a knot tighten in his own stomach as he listened to his friend describe what Dr. Thorne would later identify as severe depression with anxiety components. But what struck Michael most wasn't just the pain in Scottie's voice, but the relief as if finally being able to speak these truths aloud was providing some measure of comfort even in the midst of crisis. "How long have you been feeling like this?" Michael had asked gently. "Months," Scottie had admitted. "Maybe longer. I think I've been pretending to be okay for so long that I lost track of when I stopped actually being okay. I kept thinking it would pass, that if I just worked harder or stayed more focused, I could push through it the way I've pushed through injuries or slumps. But this is different. This isn't something I can muscle through." What's most heartbreaking is how people experiencing a mental health crisis often apply the same determination and self-reliance that serve them in other areas of life, not understanding that emotional healing requires different tools and often cannot be achieved through willpower alone. The conversation had continued with Scottie revealing specific fears that had been consuming his mental energy for weeks. He talked about the terror that his nagging injuries had permanently changed not just his body but his identity. He spoke of the crushing weight of his contract situation, feeling disrespected by the very organization he was helping lead to glory. But most profoundly, he talked about his fear of being nothing without Michael Jordan. "I don't know who I am when I'm not playing next to you," Scottie had said, the words heavy with a vulnerability Michael had never heard before. "And that scares me because I know this can't last forever. I know we're getting older, that our bodies won't always do what we want them to do. But if being your Robin is all I am, what happens when Batman's gone?" These existential concerns represented what psychologists call identity foreclosure, a phenomenon where individuals become so identified with one role or activity that they struggle to develop a broader sense of self. For an athlete in Scottie's unique position, this could create profound anxiety about his own legacy, retirement, and life transitions. Michael had listened with a growing understanding of how much pressure Scottie had been placing on himself, not just to perform athletically, but to maintain an image of composure and reliability that had become a prison rather than a source of strength. "Scottie," Michael had said during a pause in his friend's revelations, his voice firm but laced with an unfamiliar tenderness, "you know that you're so much more than basketball, right? You're one of the smartest, most intuitive people I know. You're a father, a brother, a friend who has made me better in every way. Basketball is something you do brilliantly, but it's not who you are." The response to these words would later be described by Michael as the moment that destroyed him emotionally, not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed the depth of Scottie's disconnection from his own worth and value as a human being. "I know you believe that," Scottie had said quietly, "but I don't feel it. I don't feel like I'm a good father because I'm always traveling or training. I don't feel like I'm a good friend because I've been pulling away from everyone. I don't feel like I bring joy to anyone because I can barely find any joy myself. It's like I'm living someone else's life, and I don't know how to get back to my own." How is it possible that depression can distort our perception so completely that we become unable to recognize our own positive qualities or the love that others feel for us, even when that love is consistently demonstrated and expressed? The conversation had shifted when Michael asked a question that would prove to be crucial. "Scottie, have you thought about talking to someone professional about this? Someone who specializes in helping people work through these kinds of feelings?" Scottie's response revealed another layer of his struggle, the shame and stigma he felt about needing mental health support, particularly as a professional athlete expected to demonstrate unshakable mental toughness. "I've thought about it," Scottie admitted. "But what if word gets out? What if people think I can't handle the pressure? What if the organization decides I'm not reliable anymore? I've built my whole reputation on being steady, being the guy who doesn't get rattled. If people knew I was falling apart..." This fear represented one of the most significant barriers to mental health care among professional athletes. The concern that seeking help will be interpreted as weakness or a liability rather than responsible self-care. Michael's response to this concern would later be cited by mental health professionals as an example of how to address stigma with both empathy and directness. "Scottie, listen to me," Michael had said with firm gentleness. "Getting help when you need it isn't weakness. It's intelligence. It's strength. Some of the strongest people I know have worked with therapists or counselors when they were going through difficult times. It doesn't mean you can't handle pressure. It means you're smart enough to use all available resources to take care of yourself." You can perceive that true friendship often involves not just offering comfort during a crisis, but providing a perspective that helps someone see their situation more clearly and make decisions that serve their long-term well-being. The moment that Michael would later describe as most emotionally devastating had come near the end of their conversation, when Scottie made a confession that revealed the extent to which his mental health struggles had affected his most basic sense of hope and future planning. "Mike," Scottie had said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something that I've never said out loud to anyone. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about what it would be like if I just disappeared. Not because I want to hurt myself, but because I feel like such a burden to everyone around me that maybe everyone would be better off if I wasn't here to disappoint them anymore." These words, expressing what psychologists call passive suicidal ideation, had represented the moment when Michael understood that his friend wasn't just struggling with temporary sadness or stress, but was experiencing a level of psychological pain that required immediate professional intervention. "Scottie," Michael had said, his own voice breaking with emotion, "I need you to know that you could never be a burden to me, to your family, to anyone who truly knows you. The world is better with you in it. You make my life better just by being who you are. And right now, I'm going to help you get the support you need to feel better, because you deserve to feel better, and because there are so many people who love you and want to help." What's most impressive is how someone responding to a mental health crisis can provide both emotional support and practical next steps, offering love while also ensuring that the person in crisis gets the professional help that addresses the complexity of their struggles. The remainder of their conversation had focused on immediate steps. Michael had convinced Scottie to commit to calling Dr. Ramirez first thing in the morning, had offered to accompany him to any appointments, and had made it clear that Scottie's mental health was more important than basketball, public perception, or any other concern. "I'm going to text you every morning until you tell me you're feeling better," Michael had promised. "And I want you to promise me that if you have another night like this, you'll call me immediately. Day or night, I will always pick up." By the time they ended the call at 5:34 a.m., both men had been emotionally drained, but connected in a way that transcended their previous friendship. Michael had witnessed the full extent of his friend's pain and had responded with unconditional loyalty and practical support. Scottie had experienced what it felt like to be completely vulnerable with someone and be met with acceptance rather than judgment. True strength is not never breaking. It's having the courage to ask for help when you need to be rebuilt. And sometimes the most powerful healing begins with someone simply saying, "I believe you, I love you, and we're going to figure this out together." Dr. Ramirez, who would begin working with Scottie later that same day, would describe their phone conversation as representing textbook crisis intervention, not because it followed any formal protocol, but because Michael had instinctively provided exactly what someone in a mental health crisis needs most: validation, support, hope, and a connection to professional resources. The impact of that conversation extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Within hours, Scottie would be connected with mental health professionals who specialized in working with athletes. Within days, he would begin a treatment plan that addressed both his immediate distress and the underlying patterns that had contributed to his breakdown. But perhaps most importantly, Scottie's willingness to reach out during his darkest moment and Michael's compassionate response would begin a transformation not just in their friendship, but in how the Bulls organization and eventually the entire NBA approached player, mental health, and well-being. The sound of that phone ringing at 3:17 a.m. had carried more than an emergency. It had carried trust, love, and the beginning of a healing journey that would prove that vulnerability shared with the right people can become the foundation for not just individual recovery, but systemic change that helps countless others who struggle in silence. What happened next would show that some of the most important victories in sports occur not in arenas filled with cheering crowds, but in quiet moments when someone chooses to reach out for help and someone else chooses to respond with the kind of love that saves lives and transforms our understanding of what it truly means to be strong. In the 6 months that followed, Scottie Pippen's desperate 3:00 a.m. call to Michael Jordan, the basketball world witnessed something unprecedented: the complete transformation of how a professional sports organization approached mental health. The emergence of Scottie as an advocate for athlete well-being, and a cultural shift that would inspire thousands of athletes across all sports to prioritize their mental health without fear of stigma or professional consequences. The morning after their phone conversation, Michael had personally driven to Scottie's home, arriving with coffee and the gentle determination of someone who understood that crisis intervention requires follow-through, not just an emergency response. When Scottie opened the door, his eyes still swollen from hours of crying, Michael had simply embraced his friend and said, "We're going to get through this together." Dr. Ramirez had cleared her entire schedule to meet with Scottie that afternoon, beginning what would become the most comprehensive mental health support program the Bulls organization had ever implemented for any player. Her first goal wasn't to fix Scottie's problems, but to help him understand that what he was experiencing was treatable, common among high-achieving individuals, and absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. "Scottie, what you're going through has a name, it has treatments that work, and it doesn't define your worth as a person or your capabilities as an athlete," she had explained during their first session. "Depression and anxiety are medical conditions, just like a knee injury or a torn muscle. We wouldn't expect you to play through a physical injury without treatment, and we're not going to expect you to manage this emotional injury alone. You can perceive that sometimes the most healing thing we can offer someone in crisis is not solutions or advice, but the simple reassurance that their pain is valid, treatable, and temporary, that they are not broken, just human." Within 72 hours of Scottie's call, the Bulls, largely at the direction of Michael and Phil Jackson, had assembled what Dr. Thorne would later describe as a dream team of mental health professionals: a psychiatrist who specialized in treating athletes, a cognitive behavioral therapist with expertise in perfectionism and identity issues, and a mindfulness coach who could help Scottie develop healthier coping mechanisms for stress and pressure. But perhaps most importantly, the organization, prodded by its superstar, had made a decision that would set a new standard for professional sports. They announced publicly that Scottie would be taking a temporary leave from basketball to focus on his mental and physical well-being, and that this decision was being fully supported and celebrated by the team. In a carefully managed press conference, Phil Jackson, with Michael standing beside him, addressed the media. "Scottie Pippen is one of the strongest people we know," Jackson had said, his voice calm and resolute. "His decision to prioritize his health demonstrates exactly the kind of courage and wisdom that makes him such an exceptional person and teammate. We're proud of him for seeking help, and will support him completely throughout his healing process." The notoriously difficult general manager, Jerry Krause, was conspicuously absent, a detail that spoke volumes about where the true power and loyalty within the organization resided. The public response to this announcement had been overwhelmingly positive, representing a dramatic shift from how mental health issues in professional sports had been handled historically. Instead of speculation or criticism, fans, media, and fellow athletes had responded with messages of support, shared experiences, and gratitude for Scottie's openness about his struggles. A member of the coaching staff, who had worked closely with Scottie throughout his recovery process, observed, "What we witnessed was a complete reframing of strength in professional athletics. Instead of pretending invulnerability, Scottie showed that real strength means recognizing when you need help and having the courage to seek it." What's most impressive is how one person's willingness to be vulnerable about their struggles can give permission for countless others to acknowledge their own need for support, creating ripple effects of healing that extend far beyond the original act of courage. During his first month of intensive treatment, Scottie had worked with his therapeutic team to understand the underlying patterns that had contributed to his crisis. He learned about the connection between perfectionism and anxiety, developed strategies for managing catastrophic thinking, and began building an identity that included but wasn't limited to basketball performance. "The breakthrough moment for me," Scottie would later explain, "came when my therapist asked me to describe myself without using any words related to basketball. At first, I literally couldn't do it. I had become so identified with being a basketball player that I had lost touch with all the other parts of who I am." Through cognitive behavioral therapy, Scottie had begun recognizing and challenging the negative thought patterns that had been contributing to his depression. He learned to identify when his internal critic was being unreasonably harsh and developed skills for responding to setbacks with self-compassion rather than self-attack. Dr. Thorne, who had consulted on Scottie's treatment plan, explained, "Athletes often struggle with what we call conditional self-worth, the belief that they're only valuable when they're performing at peak levels. Recovery involves learning to separate self-worth from performance and developing a more stable, internal sense of value." The mindfulness training had been particularly transformative for Scottie, teaching him techniques for staying present during anxiety-provoking situations and developing an awareness of his emotional states before they became overwhelming. He had learned to recognize the early warning signs of depression and had developed a toolkit of healthy coping strategies. You can perceive that healing from mental health struggles often involves not just addressing current symptoms, but learning entirely new ways of relating to yourself, your emotions, and your understanding of what makes life meaningful and worthwhile. By his third month of treatment, Scottie had begun sharing his experience with teammates, initially in small groups and eventually with the entire Bulls organization. These conversations had led to the implementation of mandatory mental health education for all players, coaches, and staff, as well as the establishment of regular check-ins with mental health professionals as part of routine player care. "Scottie's openness changed our entire culture," Michael reflected. "Players started talking about stress, anxiety, and emotional challenges as naturally as they discussed physical conditioning or injury prevention. It normalized mental health as part of overall athletic performance and life satisfaction." The transformation extended beyond the Bulls organization. Scottie had begun receiving messages from athletes across all professional sports, sharing their own struggles with mental health and expressing gratitude for his willingness to speak openly about treatment and recovery. Magic Johnson, who had faced his own public health battle with immense grace, reached out to collaborate with Scottie on educational initiatives. What Scottie did was show that seeking help isn't career suicide, it's career preservation, Magic observed. He proved that athletes can be vulnerable, get treatment, and come back stronger than ever. 6 months after his initial crisis, Scottie had made the decision to return to basketball, but with a completely transformed approach to both the game and his life. He had worked with sports psychologists to develop healthy boundaries around performance expectations, had established regular therapy as part of his routine self-care, and had become an advocate for mental health awareness within the NBA. "Coming back to basketball felt like coming home to something I loved rather than something I was obligated to do," Scottie explained during his return announcement. "Treatment didn't just help me manage my depression and anxiety, It helped me rediscover my joy for the game and for life in general. His first game back had been an emotional experience for everyone involved. The Chicago Stadium crowd had given him a standing ovation that lasted over 3 minutes, and his teammates had surrounded him with a support that made clear how much his courage had meant to the entire organization. What's most moving is how recovery from mental health struggles can transform not just individual well-being, but can create communities of support and understanding that make everyone stronger, more compassionate, and more authentically connected. The impact of Scottie's journey extended far beyond basketball. He had partnered with mental health organizations to develop educational programs for youth athletes, teaching them about emotional intelligence, stress management, and the importance of seeking help when struggling. These programs had been implemented in high schools and colleges across the country. Dr. Ramirez had documented the changes in the Bulls organization for a case study that would be used by other professional sports teams. What we learned is that supporting players' mental health isn't just ethically important, it's practically beneficial. Players who receive mental health support show improved performance, better team chemistry, and longer, more sustainable careers. Scottie had also established a foundation focused on mental health awareness and suicide prevention, particularly targeting young athletes who face intense pressure to maintain perfect performances and images. The foundation provided free counseling services, educational resources, and crisis intervention support. "I want every young athlete to know what I wish I had known," Scottie explained during the foundation's launch. "That struggling doesn't make you weak, that getting help makes you smart, and that your worth as a person has nothing to do with your performance in sports." True strength is not never breaking. It's having the courage to ask for help when you need to be rebuilt. And sometimes the most powerful legacy we can leave is showing others that healing is possible, support is available, and there is always hope for a better tomorrow. 1 year after his crisis call to Michael, Scottie had been invited to speak at a mental health conference attended by athletes, coaches, and sports medicine professionals from around the world. His presentation, titled "The Courage to Call for Help," had become one of the most requested talks in professional sports. "That night when I called Michael," Scottie had told the audience, "I thought I was admitting defeat. What I didn't realize was that I was actually claiming victory over shame, over isolation, over the fear that asking for help would make me appear weak. That phone call saved my life. But more importantly, it taught me that vulnerability is strength, connection is healing, and there's no problem so dark that it can't be illuminated by the right kind of support." The ripple effects continued expanding. The NBA had implemented league-wide mental health initiatives, based partly on the Bulls model. Other professional sports leagues had followed suit. Mental health awareness had become integrated into athlete training programs, from youth levels through professional ranks. Dr. Thorne, who had become a leading researcher on athlete mental health, published studies showing significant improvements in player well-being, performance longevity, and post-career life satisfaction in organizations that had implemented comprehensive mental health support programs. Scottie's courage to seek help during his crisis created a template that has been replicated across professional sports, he noted. His willingness to be vulnerable about his struggles gave permission for an entire culture to prioritize mental health without fear or shame. You can perceive that sometimes the most important thing we can do with our pain is to transform it into purpose, using our own healing journey to create pathways for others who are struggling to find hope, help, and recovery. 2 years after that transformative phone call, Scottie and Michael had co-authored a book about mental health in professional sports, combining Scottie's personal experience with Michael's perspective on supporting someone through a crisis. The book had become required reading in sports psychology programs and had helped normalize conversations about mental health throughout athletic communities. "Our friendship was already strong," Michael reflected, "but going through that crisis together created a bond that's unbreakable. I learned as much about strength from watching Scottie seek help as I ever learned from watching him make a clutch play. He showed me what real courage looks like." Scottie had continued playing basketball at an elite level, but with a completely transformed relationship to the game and to his own self-worth. His performance had actually improved in many ways, as the anxiety and perfectionism that had been weighing him down were replaced by joy, presence, and a healthy perspective on winning and losing. "Basketball is something I love to do, not something I am," Scottie explained during an interview 3 years after his crisis. "That shift in perspective has made me a better player, but more importantly, it's made me a happier person. I can have a bad game now without it affecting my sense of worth as a human being." The Bulls had won 2 more championships during Scottie's post-recovery years, and he had been quoted as saying that these victories felt more meaningful than any previous achievements because they came from a place of authentic joy rather than a desperate need to prove his worth. An assistant coach, reflecting on the organizational transformation that had resulted from Scottie's journey, observed, "We learned that taking care of our players' mental health isn't separate from helping them achieve athletic success. It's fundamental to it. Happy, mentally healthy athletes perform better, last longer, and contribute more to team chemistry." How was it possible that what initially appeared to be a breakdown could become the foundation for a breakthrough? Not just for one person, but for an entire culture that learned to value healing, authenticity, and mutual support as essential components of true strength. 5 years after that desperate 3:00 a.m. phone call, Scottie Pippen had become one of the most respected voices in professional sports mental health advocacy. His foundation had provided support to thousands of young athletes. His educational programs had been implemented in hundreds of schools, and his example had inspired countless individuals to seek help during their own dark moments. The sound of that phone ringing at 3:17 a.m. had evolved from a cry of desperation into a symbol of hope, proof that reaching out during our darkest moments can lead not just to personal healing, but to a transformation that helps heal entire communities. Dr. Ramirez, who had been present for Scottie's entire recovery journey, made an observation that captured the essence of his transformation. Scottie didn't just recover from his mental health crisis. He used it to discover a deeper understanding of strength, purpose, and connection that made his life richer in every way. His willingness to be vulnerable saved his own life and created possibilities for healing that continue expanding every day. True strength is not never breaking. It's having the courage to ask for help when you need to be rebuilt. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is show others that healing is possible. Support is available, and there is always someone willing to answer the phone when we finally find the courage to call for help. The conversation that had begun with, "I can't do this anymore," had evolved into a message that resonated around the world. You don't have to do it alone. And in quiet moments, when other athletes, students, or anyone struggling with mental health challenges found the courage to reach out for help, they carried with them the knowledge that asking for support isn't weakness. It's the first step toward a stronger, more authentic, and more joyful life. Scottie Pippen's crisis had become his gift to the world, proof that vulnerability shared with the right people can become the foundation for not just individual recovery, but a cultural transformation that makes space for everyone to be human, to struggle, and to heal in communities of love and support that understand the true meaning of strength.